Hey! Funny seeing you here. Why is it every time I'm in the void, you find me? Well, here we are together, and oddly enough, I think it's about time for us to change the pace a little bit here. Most of the time when we're talking to each other, we are talking federal government and all the national stuff, Congress, the president, all that good stuff. But right now, I think we should take ourselves a break and, more importantly, fulfill a legal obligation and talk about the Missouri Constitution. This conversation is required by Missouri law. If you teach a government or a political science class or a history class even, you have to cover the Missouri Constitution in some fashion. So that's what we're doing here. We're talking about the Missouri Constitution. That right there is Missouri's General Assembly. Missouri's General Assembly, that's just another name for Missouri's Congress. But they don't call it Congress because nothing can be easy. Everything has to have different names. So here in Missouri, we have our own legislative branch, and it's called the General Assembly. It's not called Congress, just FYI. Of course, that's located in Jefferson City. Here is Missouri's flag. Missouri's flag. Hopefully I don't confuse Missouri and America too many times in this conversation. But what we will do as we talk about the Missouri Constitution is start from the top. This is what Google shows when I Google the Missouri Constitutional Convention, but the Missouri Constitution has actually been written several times. There have been several Missouri Constitutional Conventions that have yielded different Missouri constitutions. The very first of those was written in 1820, which is, I think, when this rendering is supposed to be from, I think. Just trying to add some color into your lives. I know it's black and white, but still. Just trying to add a little, not everything should be red font in my face, so sometimes I put up a picture, I'm not sure what it is. So enjoy. You're free to track that down, and if you can confirm what it is, just let me know. Anyways, the Missouri Constitution was written first in 1820, but it has been rewritten several times since then. Now, it was also written in the 1860s. At the very beginning, 1861, 1863. This is kind of in the middle of the Civil War, really towards the beginning of the Civil War. And Missouri is kind of weird in the Civil War. Most states are like, we're fighting for the South or we're fighting for the North. But Missouri kind of was going both ways. We had people fighting for the North and the South. And it's kind of exemplified by the Missouri Constitutional Convention, which took some time to try to figure out whether we wanted to be with the North or with the South. It took us 3 years, really, and we ultimately decided to reject secession, which meant fight with the North, even though for many years a large chunk of Missourians fought for the South. Now, on top of that, it was also rewritten after the Civil War in 1865. We took another go at it in 1875, but none of these constitutions are the Constitution that Missouri has today. Okay, none of these constitutions are the Constitution that we're using today. I'm kind of confusing myself. I don't know about you guys, but I watch all that Marvel stuff right now, and I'm crazy about the Loki show on Disney Plus. That Loki show, and you have all those different Lokis. That's what this is here. You have the kid Loki, and the alligator Loki, and the woman Loki. Well, the man Loki, the Missouri Constitution that we are familiar with today, was actually written in 1945. Once again, just to repeat, the Missouri Constitution that we use today was written in 1945. Now, the 1945 Missouri Constitution has a cute little provision in it. Since 1962, here in Missouri, we actually have an election every 20 years as to whether we want to keep the Missouri Constitution or discard it and have another constitutional convention to rewrite it yet again. So every 20 years we have that choice. And since 1962, we've chosen to stick with the Missouri Constitution we have now. You have Missouri Constitution, the election in 62 and 82 and 2002 and 2022. So I'm actually recording this in 2021. But nonetheless, in 22, there will be a vote. There will be a vote about whether we here in Missouri want to keep the Constitution as is, the Missouri Constitution, or whether we want to update it. Now, we are required to cover the U.S. Constitution in this class, and as you know, I've done that largely by giving you the assignment of reading it. But reading the U.S. Constitution is not that difficult, at least in terms of time commitment, because it's only like 10 pages, give or take, depending on what font size you're using. The Missouri Constitution, though, is nearly 200 pages. This is a big, big document. So as a result, I'm not assigning that you read it. Instead, I'm just assigning that you listen to my conversation, or I summarize its key parts to you. I think that's the thing. I think that's where everybody wins. I think that's where we win. Now, with that in mind, let's go ahead and cover the very first thing that's in the Missouri Constitution, and that's the Preamble. Missouri Constitution has its very own Preamble, and I don't need you to know it word for word, but I do need you to know one weird thing about it. Look at that part. It says, "We the people of Missouri," kind of calls back to the U.S. Constitution there. But listen to this next part. "With profound reverence for the supreme ruler of the universe, and grateful for his goodness," because I guess the supreme ruler of the universe is a man, "we do establish this Constitution for the better government of the state." That part cracks me up. Just it amuses me, the fact that we do not call this higher power by any actual name. We call it the supreme ruler of the universe. That sounds like a Marvel character more than it does any actual deity. Are we talking about God? I mean, probably. They were pretty religious back then. Pretty religious now, but still. So we're talking about God? Maybe. Could have been talking about this guy. I don't know. I don't pretend to know. But nonetheless, that the part that you need to know is the deity that they reference in the preamble, which is supreme ruler of the universe. That's just so weird, isn't it? Isn't it weird? Now, with that in mind, I did want to reference one more time, and this is kind of something you'll come up with over and over again, is the Missouri Constitution mirrors the U.S. Constitution in several critical ways, but one of those is the fact that the Missouri Preamble starts off the same way as the U.S. Preamble does. And this really feeds into a theme of the Missouri Constitution. It's actually kind of redundant in some places. Just like that beginning of the Preamble is kind of redundant. It's saying "we the people of Missouri" when there's already a Constitution saying "we the people of the United States." The Missouri Constitution actually gives us several rights over the course of its document that we already kind of get in the U.S. Constitution. Why is that? Like, if you read the Missouri Constitution, you'll read that it gives you freedom of religion and freedom of speech and stuff like that. And you're like, why are we having this conversation? Of course I have freedom of speech. It's in the U.S. Constitution. Well, you have to think of this from a historical perspective, folks. You have to think of it from a historical perspective. Again, the Missouri Constitution was first written in 1820. That's the first time it was written, was in 1820. Now, we didn't know at the time, in the year 1820, we didn't know that the U.S. Constitution was going to be applied to the states. We didn't know at that time. And we didn't really know until the 14th Amendment. The 14th Amendment has the Incorporation Clause, which says anything in the U.S. Constitution applies to the states, including, of course, Missouri. But the 14th Amendment wasn't passed until 1868. So in 1820, they're writing this document, giving us very familiar things like freedom of speech, due process, we don't have just general stuff like that. Because at the time, we didn't know that the U.S. Constitution actually applied to Missouri. But the 14th Amendment officially said for all states, if it's in the U.S. Constitution, it applies to all the states. So, oddly enough, nothing in the Missouri Constitution can contradict what's in the U.S. Constitution. And the things in the Missouri Constitution that do contradict the U.S. Constitution are essentially null and void. And that's something, I'll show you an example of that here in just a little bit. Now, with that in mind, just once again, I'm just kind of reiterating the things I just told you here. The 14th Amendment said that anything in the U.S. Constitution would automatically be applied to the states. But just to reiterate my point, I know I'm being repetitive, we didn't know that in 1820. So that's why the Missouri Constitution can be a little repetitive. Matter of fact, one of the things you'll notice about the Missouri Constitution, as with a lot of state constitutions, is because the U.S. Constitution already has the basics covered, the state constitutions will tend to get a lot more specific. Let me give you an example you don't need to know. There is the Second Amendment in the U.S. Constitution. I think we're pretty well versed with the Second Amendment. It says you have a right to bear arms. That's right there in the Second Amendment. Now, there is a portion about the right to bear arms in the Missouri Constitution. Oh, and there it is. And I know it's in a really small font. You might have trouble reading it depending on the screen you're using. But it says the right of every citizen to keep and bear arms, the accessories typical to the normal functions of such arms in defense of home, family, property, or when lawfully summoned in the aid of the civil power shall not be questioned. The rights guaranteed by this section shall be unalienable. Any restriction on these rights shall be subject to strict scrutiny, and the state of Missouri shall be obligated to uphold. So on and on and on it goes. You can't even see the bottom of it because it just goes on for a full paragraph. So sometimes these state constitutions, such as Missouri's, likes to build on the general rights that the U.S. gave us. And so this does cut back to what I just said a moment ago, the 14th Amendment gives us, and that's incorporation. Incorporation theory, again, it's in the 14th Amendment. It generally says, this is the exact language, you don't need to know exact language, no state shall make or enforce any law which that abridges the privileges or immunities of the citizens of the United States. And once again, just in plain language, that means if it's in this, it applies automatically to this. It doesn't matter if you put freedom of speech in the Missouri Constitution. As of the 14th Amendment, it is automatically assumed for every Missourian, thanks to the U.S. Constitution. That's incorporation theory. We just covered it on the previous slide, but I thought I'd give you one more go on it. And so it applies to almost anything. There's some things that apply to the U.S. Constitution that don't apply to the state governments. For instance, they can't. The state government can't coin its own money, for instance. But at the end of the day, that's what incorporation theory means. Now, again, the purpose of this conversation is really to give you the basics of Missouri Constitution. There's no way I can cover absolutely everything in the Missouri Constitution. You have stuff about like riverboat gambling and bingo regulations in the Missouri Constitution. I think I'm comfortable skipping over some of that stuff and cutting to the basics, the key stuff, the structure of Missouri government according to the Missouri Constitution. Now, the good news here is that it's not going to be that much different from what you're familiar with, which is 3 branches of government, and all of them have the same roles. You have a legislative branch that makes the laws. In this case, it's called the General Assembly, which is essentially Missouri's Congress. You have an executive branch that enforces the laws. Missouri has its own president and vice president, only we don't call it the president and vice president. We call it the governor and lieutenant governor. And oddly enough, I just mentioned this real quick, the president and vice president, as we just talked about in Chapter 10, they are elected at the same time. We vote for them jointly, but you actually vote for the Missouri governor and the Missouri lieutenant governor separately. Anyways, we also have a judicial branch, and we'll talk a little bit about the judicial branch later, just like the federal court system, which we'll learn about in Chapter 12. There's 3 different levels to the courts, topping out with a Missouri Supreme Court. But Missouri is actually pretty innovative with our court system in one aspect: how we select our judges. We select our judges in a different kind of way than judges are named at the federal level. It's called the Missouri Plan, and we'll spell that out a little bit later. But this is actually a really cutting-edge plan that has been so popular, like 20 other states have adopted the Missouri Plan. I bet you didn't think Missouri was innovative when it came to anything, but surely enough they are when it comes to a very important thing: how we select our judges here in the state of Missouri. So let's walk through each of these branches one at a time. Let's start at the very tippy top here with Missouri's legislative branch, which is called the General Assembly. Let's talk about the General Assembly. Now, the General Assembly, like Missouri's Congress, is bicameral. That means you have a House, and in Missouri, the House is huge. It's 163 districts. So we split up Missouri into 163rds, and each of those 163rds sends 1 rep to Jeff City. They are up for election every 2 years. That's the same as people in the U.S. House of Representatives, perhaps you remember. Now, because it's bicameral, that means we have another chamber. This other chamber is called the Senate. Just like in the U.S. Congress, it's called the Senate. And in addition to splitting Missouri up into 163rds, we also split it up into 34ths. And each of those 34ths sends one person to serve in the Missouri Senate in Jefferson City. Half of what we do with them, they have 4-year terms in the Senate, 4-year terms in the Missouri Senate. Maybe remember they have 6-year terms in the U.S. Senate. But in the Missouri Senate, it's 4-year terms. And what we do is half of those 34 are up for re-election every 2 years. So let's drill down a little bit into these two chambers, just like we have done in Chapter 9, talking about the U.S. Congress. Let's drill down. First things first, let's talk about the Missouri House of Representatives first. Here's a little factoid that you don't need to know. 4th largest in America. You don't need to know that. It's not important or anything. A little factoid in case you want to be interested. Missouri's House doesn't have to have 163 people, but we've chosen that it should for some reason. So let's walk through this sucker. Some of this information is going to be pretty familiar to you. You got to be at least 24 years old. That's 1 year younger. Serve in the Missouri House. 24 years old, though, folks. Got to be at least 24. On top of that, got to be a qualified Missouri voter. You have to have been able to have voted in Missouri for 2 years leading up to your election. 2 years. Last but not least, you need to be a resident of the district for 1 year leading up to elections. So that does mean if you're going to represent that particular 163rd in Jeff City, you have to have lived in that 163rd for at least a year. Now, on top of that, you do have term limits. They don't have term limits in the U.S. Congress, but there are term limits in Missouri. And you have an 8-year term limit, so do the math. That means you can serve 4 full terms if you want. First of all, if you want. Second of all, if you're successful. I'm sure many people want to serve the 8 full years, but don't get the chance to because they get voted out. Now, on top of that, let's walk through the Missouri Senate for a few. Obviously, if you're going to be in the Senate, you're going to be in a little bit more of a prestigious body, and as a result, the thresholds will get higher in a hurry. In the House, you got to be 24 at least. In the Senate, you got to be at least 30. Still pretty young, though. Still pretty young. On top of that, you got to be a qualified Missouri voter for 3 years before the election, so pretty much copy-paste there. Although with 1 year tacked on. Although the third requirement is a direct copy and paste. You got to be a resident of the district for 1 year. Got to be a resident of the district for 1 year. Now, maybe you remember that there are no term limits in the U.S. Senate. That is not the case in the Missouri Senate. There are term limits, and it's 8 years max. So, to be clear, you can serve 8 years in the House, and you can serve 8 years in the Senate. All told, mathematically, you could add that up, I'm sure. Now, obviously, what they do in the General Assembly is they make Missouri laws. They make state laws. But interestingly enough, they are not the only people in Missouri allowed to make laws. We are. We, the people of Missouri, can make laws ourselves without these guys lifting a finger. True story. Now, that's not true on the federal level. On the federal level, if Congress doesn't make the law, then the law doesn't get made. But here in Missouri, if the Missouri General Assembly isn't acting on the laws we want it to, we, the people, can. And we do that through initiatives. And initiatives, we talked about this briefly in Chapter 1. That's when citizens use petitions. They will walk around with clipboards everywhere in Missouri. If they get enough legal signatures on those, they can present them to a judge, and whatever issue it is they're promoting will get the issue on a ballot. This is how we get things like a raising minimum wage in Missouri. These guys didn't give it to us. We gave that to ourselves. That's how we have legalized medicinal marijuana. These guys didn't give that to us. We gave it to ourselves. That's how we expanded access to Medicaid, which is health insurance for the poor, here in Missouri. These guys didn't give that to us. We gave it to ourselves via the initiative. Here's what it takes to get an initiative. Make sure you know this, because you can change Missouri law without the General Assembly ever lifting a finger. Matter of fact, you can even change the Missouri Constitution. Let's talk about the law first. Here's the rule. It does get a little minutiae heavy, but this is pretty important. If you have something you want in Missouri law, you have to go to at least 2/3 of Missouri's congressional districts and get at least 5% of the population to sign your petition. .5% of the population in 2/3 of Missouri's congressional districts. Doing that will allow you to put something on the ballot to change Missouri law. These things are called propositions. When you vote, you might see Prop A or Prop B. That's Proposition A or Proposition B. If you're voting on that in future elections, which you probably will be, the General Assembly has said they want to tinker with this process and make it harder to do. We'll see if they do that. But regardless, if you're voting on a proposition that is a proposed change to Missouri law that we, the people, through some petition, put on the ballot ourselves. Now, that's just if you want to change Missouri law. If you want to change the Missouri Constitution, it's 8%. 8% increase to propose a new constitutional amendment here in Missouri. So you would need 8% of 2/3 of Missouri's congressional districts. And when you vote on those, they won't be called propositions. Propositions are just if you're changing a new law or a statute. Instead, it'll be called Amendment 1 or Amendment 2 or Amendment 3. Those are proposed changes to the Missouri Constitution that were put there via petition. You might see if you're walking around OTC's campus, usually in the fall, there'll be some people with clipboards walking around and they'll say, hey, would you like to sign a thing for whatever? And it's up to you. If you want to, you can. It doesn't cost you anything. But they're trying to get enough signatures to add something to the ballot. All right, so here's some notable amendments that have been added over the years. Actually, the very first amendment was that all political power is vested in and derived from the people. Once again, thank you. I'm pretty sure that's already covered in the U.S. Constitution, but you know, this cuts way, way back to the origin of Missouri. On top of that, the 29th, we have unions, union protections. We'll talk about union protections a little bit more. In what chapter? Chapter 7. We'll talk about union protections in Chapter 7. But nonetheless, unions are protected in the Missouri Constitution. Employees have the right to organize and bargain collectively. On top of that, you have the 30th, which always amuses me. If you commit treason against Missouri, that could only consist in levying war against it or adhering to its enemies. Now, I don't know who the enemies of Missouri are, or even how you can commit treason against Missouri. I really don't know what that even consists of. How would you levy war against Missouri? If I got a bunch of friends together in Kansas and invaded Kansas City, I don't know how that's supposed to work, but I always thought that was pretty amusing. The 33rd Amendment said that a marriage can only exist between a man and a woman, but we know this, right? We know that according to the Supreme Court, thanks to the Supreme Court, marriage can now exist between a man and another man or a woman and another woman. So this amendment in the Missouri Constitution contradicts the U.S. Constitution. So what happens to it? Nothing. It still sticks around in the Missouri Constitution like a ghost. It has no enforcement power. It's unconstitutional. It doesn't exist, even though we can still see it right there in any Missouri Constitution. There's also the 34th Amendment, which says, English shall be the official language of all proceedings in this state. I don't know if that was an actual problem or anything, but nonetheless, the official language of all government meetings is English. Matter of fact, there's almost always going to be initiatives. There's almost always going to be these amendments that we, the people, propose in every single national election. November of 2022 will have some. November of 2024 will have some. And if you're in the future and you see this in 2022 or 2024 and that's not the case, you're free to email me and call me out for being wrong. But just about every November is going to have itself major issues that we, the people, are trying to get past ourselves. All right, let's move on from the legislative branch, start talking about the executive branch. And once again, essentially the president, the top executive official of Missouri is the Missouri governor. Make sure you know who the Missouri governor is. I'll show him. It's a man. I'll show him to you here in a few. Do you know who it is right now? You know who it is right now? We'll see. So what must the Missouri governor be? Well, once again, this is a very powerful position here in Missouri, so the threshold's pretty high. You got to be at least 30 years old. It's not quite as high as the U.S. president, but nonetheless higher than most other positions throughout the land. On top of that, you must have been a U.S. citizen for the past 15 years. This cuts right back to the conversation we just had in Chapter 10. You can be an immigrant and be governor of Missouri. You can be an immigrant and serve anywhere in Missouri's government. It's really only the U.S. presidency where we start raising questions about whether you're allowed to be an immigrant or not. On top of that, you must have been a resident of Missouri for at least 10 years. Let's see, Missouri Constitution trying to protect us from having out-of-staters come in, and carpetbag is what it's called when they run in a state that they don't live in. Got to live in Missouri for at least 10 years if you're going to run to be its governor. On top of that, you are up for election every 4 years, always presidential years. You have 2 terms, just like the president. So sometimes these governor races can mirror how the presidential race is working out. Now, the governor of Missouri has several constitutional responsibilities. In Chapter 10, we covered 7 responsibilities for the U.S. president. There are several constitutional responsibilities for the Missouri governor. Some of them we really care about. Others, maybe we don't care about them so much. But first of all, believe it or not, your governor has a role in the U.S. Constitution. True story. The Missouri governor has a role in the U.S. Constitution because anytime the U.S. House or the U.S. Senate loses a member from Missouri, it's up to the governor to fill that seat. The governor can fill it with anybody who meets the constitutional qualifications. Sometimes the governor may choose himself or herself. You know who'd be a really good senator? Me! And they promote themselves to, now all of a sudden we have a vacancy at the Missouri governor position. They can do that. They can do that. Fill vacancies in the House or Senate of the U.S. Very important role. On top of that, maybe not as important, Commander-in-Chief of the state military forces. Maybe sometimes with like using the National Guard to sandbag certain cities if there's flooding. Maybe then they'll exercise that. But for the most part, it's not like, it's not like Missouri is going to war with another state or anything like that. Now, on top of that, the governor of Missouri also has pardon power. They also have pardon power. Now, the U.S. president, right now that's President Biden, he has pardon power. But again, the president can only pardon people for federal crimes. If you have been convicted and thrown in jail for a state crime, Biden can't help you. Constitutionally, he can't help you. Only the governor of Missouri can help you, if it's Missouri that you're in prison. So you need the governor to help you for state crimes, the president to pardon you for federal crimes. Anyways, reprieves, pardons, commutations of sentences for all offenses except for treason and impeachment right here in Missouri. Now, on top of that, just like the U.S. president, Governor Parson, I just gave the answer away, didn't I? I just gave the answer away. But Governor Parsons can sign or veto bills in Missouri. I was quizzing you, and I gave you the answer before I revealed the answer here in a few. But anyways, the Governor Parsons can sign or veto bills just like in the legislative branch. And this one we don't really care about so much. The governor is required to submit a budget to the General Assembly within 30 days, the very beginning of the legislative session, so that the governor can reveal what he wants in the budget, and theoretically the legislative branch can go, "You got it, boss, we'll see what we can do." But the General Assembly pretty much throws it in the trash every time they receive it. So this is largely a symbolic power. Now, all these requirements that you see up here also apply to the lieutenant governor. He has the same two duties. The lieutenant governor has the same two duties as the vice president of the United States. Do you remember those two duties from chapter 10? Power number 1, stay alive and take over for the take over for the president if he dies or resigns. That's the same thing lieutenant governor has to do. Second of all, lieutenant governor is also, do you remember? Also president of the Senate and casts tie-breaking votes if need be. Also serves on several commissions. Anyways, the governor of Missouri, make sure you know who it is. It is this guy. That's him speaking at OTC. I was at that event. He's a nice enough guy. I just got a chance to shake his hand, but that's all. On top of that, there's his name, Governor Mike Parsons. And I always have trouble remembering if it's Parson or Parsons, but it is Parsons, like multiple Parson people. All right, so that is 2 branches of the government. Let's take some time to talk to the third branch of government. The third branch of government is the judicial branch. And like I said, I don't have a ton of interest in going over the judicial branch because there's just too much to it. Instead, I really want to focus on the Missouri plan. And the Missouri plan is how we get our judges here in America. The Missouri plan, again, is how we get our judges here in America. Let me rephrase. Good grief. I get talking for like 40 minutes, all of a sudden I forget what I'm talking about. All right, sorry. Let me start over. The Missouri plan is how we get our judges here in Missouri. How we get them at the federal level for America is a whole other thing. That's chapter 12. We'll get there when we get there. Instead, Missouri plan is for judges in Missouri. This would be a great time for me to edit this or stop it, start over. But you know what? I'm committed to intellectual honesty. You heard me say it wrong. I'm going to leave it up on the board so that you know I can get stuff wrong too. There. See, I'm trying to relate to you. I'm trying to find common ground with you. Anyways, let's talk about the Missouri plan. How does it work? How do we get judges, and why on earth is it so popular so that dozens of other states are adopting it across America? Well, first things first, you're going to have these 3 entities. You're going to have the Missouri Bar Association, which is like Missouri's top organization of lawyers, working with the governor and the Chief Justice of Missouri's Supreme Court. You're going to have these 3 entities working together to staff something called the Nonpartisan Judicial Commission. This is a very important organization, the Nonpartisan Judicial Commission. These people are not elected Republicans, elected Democrats, anything. They are considered to be constitutional experts, legal experts. This organization is very powerful, is very important because they have one job. They have one job, but it's a very important job. And that's anytime there's a vacancy among some Missouri judgeship, anytime there's a vacancy in a Missouri court, their job is to name 3 candidates to fill that vacancy. 3 candidates, candidate A, candidate B, candidate C. Of the 3 candidates, who is the best person to fill that job? Who decides that? We leave that up to the governor. The governor picks somebody and says, you know what, you would be a really good judge. Or, by the way, the governor can reject all 3, and then the NPJC has to name 3 more candidates. So already you can see why the Missouri plan is popular. First of all, it's always real controversial to ask people to elect judges. In many states, they ask people to vote for judges directly. In Missouri, we get the opportunity to vote for judges, but, I mean, we don't know anything about the law, really. We don't know anything about specific judges. We really don't. And so what the Missouri plan does is it offers you quality control. It gives you experts to decide who would be really good judges, and then it allows our top statewide elected official to choose from those 3. Now, after the governor chooses the person that he thinks would be the best judge for that position, that person serves for 1 year as a judge so that we all get a taste of what they're like as a judge. At that moment, you and I finally enter the conversation because we the people, there we go, got my order wrong, but we the people, we Missourians get to vote on that judge based on their qualifications, based on the fact on how they've judged for a year, and just based on any other factor we want. Chances are we still won't know much about them because Missourians do not keep, Americans in general don't keep track of our judges. Okay, the average American can only name like 1 or 2 Supreme Court judges. How many can you name right now? So again, we do vote, but we aren't really familiar as a population with who these judges are. But because of all the quality control that's gone into it, like the legal women voters and the Missouri Bar, vouch for almost all of these judges as being really good at their job. So even if we decide to fire them and replace them with somebody else, we know that they're going to be filled by a pretty competent person because of the quality control from the Missouri plan. Now, if Missourians vote to keep that judge, they serve for 12 years at a time. You got to, so there are 12-year terms. Oddly enough, there's an age cap in Missouri. You can't run for re-election as a judge if you're older than 70. That's not super important information or anything. I just think it's interesting that there's an age cap. Anyways, voters can vote to keep a judge, which means they serve their first 12-year term. They can also vote no, and if they do that, then the NPJC tries to fill that vacancy with 3 more candidates. Guys, that is a rundown of the Missouri Constitution. This particular lecture that you just listened to will not pop up anywhere else in the semester. It will not be on your second exam. It will not include, the second exam will not include the Missouri Constitution. It will not be on your final exam. This is just something that is a little bit of a side road to fulfill a constitutional and legal requirement here in Missouri. But nonetheless, I hope that you learned a couple things, and I hope you do well on any attached Missouri Constitution assignments to this lecture. All right, thank you so much.